will call to order the Public Safety Coordinating Council meeting agenda for February 2022. My name is Eric Geyer. I'm the Director of Community Justice, and I am the chair of this group. This morning, we are going to look at some of the current trends in our community with some local law enforcement statistics. And but before we do that, I'd like to welcome Judge Bloom. Your Honor, I believe you are the presiding judge officially. Is that correct?
It's true. I am officially the presiding judge.
Congratulations. I'm sorry. I mean, congratulations solely. So, and Judge Mejia, thank you so much. We want to recognize you a little more formally at our next meeting, but you have been involved, I believe, with this committee for a number of years now as the representative from the bench. Is that correct?
Few years, yep.
All right. Well, we certainly are grateful for everything you've been able to contribute to this group. And like I said, we're going to do something hopefully to recognize you a little bit more formally at our next meeting. So thank you. And also today we have Deputy Chief Graham from the City of Medford Police Department, as Chief Ivins is not able to attend today. So I think Deputy Chief Graham will be presenting on behalf of MPD when we look at some of these statistics. So welcome all. First order of business is the minute adoption for January. If everybody had a chance to read those, would accept a recommendation to, is there any discussion on the meeting minutes as sent?
Move to approve the minutes.
Motion from Dr. Ayers-Probinski. Any second?
Second.
We have a second from Mayor Sparacino. So we have the move to approve the minutes on the floor. Is anyone or any members opposed to approving the minutes? Hearing no opposition, by a show of hands, those members who are in approval, would you please raise your hand signifying approval of the minutes? Excellent. And then the motion passes. So we've talked about a lot of different subjects in the Public Safety Coordinating Council over the last 2 or 3 years. Everything from the way bias crimes are prosecuted and looked at on the state level, the homelessness problem in our community and the crossover to law enforcement. We've looked at mental health. We've looked at parole and probation as we have formally presented. We've talked about the jail in this setting. And one of the things that we talked about on the executive group level when we try and set the agenda and identify topics was just the need to kind of talk about some of the data regarding the criminal justice system. And I noticed that we have both Dr. Carter and Dr. Ayers-Probinski here, who could both just shake their head and say, be careful with some of these statistics to read too much into them. There's a lot of factors that go into them, but it does kind of establish a baseline for us when we talk about the volume of what's going on in our community and as trends shift. I've been working in government for about 24, 25 years. And I don't think it's out of line or sensationalistic to say we've never really seen changes like we have in the last 2 or 3 years to our system through COVID, through Measure 110, through some of the other reform initiatives that have happened, and through commercial cannabis in our community. So there's a lot of unknowns, but I do want to hand this over. The sheriff was nice enough to coordinate this and kind of provide some structure. And we'll be hearing from a number of our different entities in terms of what we're seeing numerically in regards to the criminal justice system in Jackson County. So, Sheriff, I hopefully gave you enough of a buffer regarding reading too much into the data, but I will turn it over to you now to talk about what this project has looked like.
All right. Thank you, Eric. I'm going to share my screen here. Hopefully this is smooth. Okay. So as Eric introduced this, as we got together and decided we just wanted to look at some different things that were going on to see if there were changes from prior years, or really, in essence, the way I look at it is we've kind of established almost this new kind of baseline because of all the changes that we've experienced in the last few years. And hopefully things will go back to pre-COVID soon, but we don't know. There's certainly been some wide sweeping change legislatively and some other things that I think it's just to create some awareness for this PSCC and to keep members of our community apprised of what's going on and what we're seeing in a criminal justice system here. All right. So here's, as we talk about data can always be interpreted in many ways. And so, what we're doing is just kind of presenting some numbers, not really making inferences as to what is exactly causing numbers or decreases in some and increases in others. It's just really something for us to look at, maybe discuss later. But One thing to be mindful of in October of 2020, so this is in the pandemic year, the first year, as you know, we also switched to NIBRS from OUCR. So NIBRS is a national incident-based reporting system. It went, most agencies, I think, were tasked with trying to switch this at a national level in January of 2020. We got it in October of 2020, so not too bad. We were on OUCR for 9 months of that year or so, almost 10 months, and then switched to NIBRS. And the data just doesn't look quite the same. The way it's captured, the way we capture it as an agency ourselves, and I'm going to let Medford talk about their agency, it's just different. So things have changed slightly. So you're not going to be looking at an apple and an apple per se. We can get close, but it's just not the same. For instance, in our prior system, if deputies were busy and they took a case number for a theft of a bicycle that had no serial number, that had no identifiable markings that we could track or enter into LEDs, which would be our law enforcement database. There was no suspects and the value was say $100. We didn't have to write a report. We could use a CAD report to document that crime. And now if you don't write a report, the number is not counted in NIBRS. So our reporting so on our property crime, for instance, you're going to see some pretty significant drops. And we do think there has been drops for many reasons, but not maybe as significant as the number shows. That's just one example. We also changed records management systems, report writing systems, jail management systems, and with new changes always come some headaches of how to use these systems efficiently. You throw NIBRS on top of that. And so our records management has been tasked with a pretty big change over the last couple of years. And so data just doesn't quite look the same. So with that, we'll go on though. Other factors, why data doesn't look the same for us. The global pandemic, as we know, it changed lifestyles, way people, moved about, people working from home. For instance, we saw reduction in home burglaries the first year of the pandemic, a significant drop. Well, it makes sense if everybody's at home, right? Our social services have been impacted. We lost capacity with our addiction treatment facilities, with our social service facilities, shelters for homeless. It altered the operations of the criminal justice system. Patrol activity, people, officers, deputies were asked to take a step back a little bit, especially during the onset of the pandemic, not knowing what we were dealing with. So proactivity was down a little. There was less traffic out. Bars were closed. Retail stores were closed. There's just a lot of different things that impacted some of the numbers. Jail capacity. We reduced our jail capacity. We'll talk about that, but in accordance with best practices and trying to keep or mitigate the COVID threat within our facility, we had to reduce jail capacity. Court operations also slowed down considerably during the onset of the pandemic. And so there's just a lot of changes in our criminal justice system. And I think it really is hard to look at, post 2020 numbers to pre-2020 numbers, right? And then we have our legislative influences. Measure 110, that's certainly new for the United States. Oregon, he likes to be a pioneer, and so we decriminalize small amounts of drugs, and that's changed numbers. And some other things, our cannabis production has been an issue for us for many years, and that drives certain crime categories and certain livability issues for our community for sure. So just a lot of different factors to look at, and that's not even including some of the national factors that we won't get into today because this is a local group, but still. So suicides and overdoses or deaths of despair. So we look at the trends in our county, and this is a pretty alarming number, especially when you look at the overdoses. The trend is way up this year. So in 2021, we're looking at about 90 ish overdose deaths, which is up considerably, almost 50, I think 50 from the previous year. So that's over 100% increase in overdose deaths. Now that's asterisk there because we're still waiting on toxicology on a lot of cases. So the number could fluctuate a little bit, meaning it could go down by a couple, it could go up by a couple. This is our best estimate from our medical examiners program based on the evidence that they collect at the scene, that detectives collect, that patrol collects as to the cause and manner of death. So we're fairly confident in this number, although I do have to caveat it because we have toxicologists to come in and confirm that as time goes on. They were way backed up at the crime lab this year. It's been busy everywhere. But you can see suicides were down, which was good. We've heard a lot about national trends as suicides up, and this year in Jackson County we were down, so that's a good number. But the overdoses is really concerning. Law enforcement response to heroin and fentanyl overdoses this year, as you can see, significantly more for law enforcement responses than the years prior. Again, consistent with the numbers we're seeing. And these don't have to be, these aren't overdoses per se. These are incidents of overdose. So where we've deployed Narcan or called medical or some other intervention, but this is just what the health department has tracked. So this is, these numbers aren't going to be exact, but this is what they have on file as reported by law enforcement agencies. And that's the Jackson County Health Department. Medford Police Department, they, in a city, you can get to medical calls differently than in a county. So the Medford Police Department, being fairly robust with their staffing, they are able to respond a lot of times in conjunction or even prior to medical, which it's the opposite in the county jurisdiction because of the square miles that are covered. But they've deployed Narcan during 68 incidents this year to people in need. 69 individuals were administered Narcan, and 83 total doses of Narcan were delivered by Medford Police Department, and 62 resulted in a transport to the hospital. So the desired outcome of being able to sustain this person or keep them alive until medical could intervene and take care of them. So that's a huge number for the Medford Police. Kudos to them for responding in these incidents and really taking on this role that's kind of newer. The year prior, they had 26 responses. So good job, MPD. And then DJ, did you have anything you wanted to add with regard to this information?
We've been doing this since 2015, and our total numbers are 183 for successful deployments of Narcan. So a significant portion of that occurred this year. It's really, every watch commander report, we see that this is happening all the time. We're engaging in this.
All right, thanks, sir. We just wanted to go through some crime trends, statistically, some numbers. And as you can see, with crimes against person, our numbers are a little bit lower this year than years prior, a little higher than last year, but fairly consistent over the last three. We look at crimes against society. So, your disorderly conducts, trespassing, public intoxication, crimes that don't necessarily that people call in, but there's not necessarily a person victim associated with this. It could be a business or it could be a location, a government entity, so to speak. Those crimes for us in the county are down, at least the way we reported. Again, I just want to caveat that, we're still figuring out these new systems and how data is captured and reported, but they are down. This number, homicides are up for us, and we've seen a trend over the last 3 years. And this is really, these are obviously the most egregious crime, and those being up. We've seen an increase in violent crime and serious crime across the board. And so, that's what we would like to see trending way down, of course. Nationwide, homicides are up, as you probably have heard or know. It's just been a tumultuous few years, and homicides are up across the board, across the nation in many jurisdictions. Drug offenses are way down. Again, Measure 110, I think, is probably the main contributor to this, aside from, maybe a bit of a pullback on some of the proactive stuff, but that was more during 2020, not 2021. And you can still see the numbers are a little bit lower for us. So we're coming across or arresting less people for drug offenses, which, again, I think is consistent with Measure 110. I don't personally think that this is good. I think I'd rather see these numbers up and the other numbers down, such as the overdoses and homicides, but that's a discussion to have maybe a little bit later. DUIs are about the same. The one thing that I did notice this year, anecdotally at least, is, reading watch commander reports, is that we seem to have more crashes, so more DUI arrests following a crash. And I do know our fatals were way up this year. I don't have that exact number as of right now, but our fatals were up considerably across the county this past year than years prior. In fact, it's going to be one of the highest years we've had in probably a decade, I think. But there was a lot of fatalities on the road. Sex offenses for us way up. It was down in 2020. We kind of understand that trend, meaning when people were not out and about, when schools were closed, mandatory reporters weren't seeing, potential victims on a daily basis or at least weekly basis. A lot of those reports that we get now and got prior to 2020 weren't coming in. So the 2021 numbers being up, we think is kind of a normal swing based on things being kind of shut down for 2020. And then we also have our SOSET team. So we're seeing this, some combined, increased reporting and then some proactivity with our SOSET team. Weapon offenses are down for the sheriff's office. Again, this is, I think, based on some proactivity. A lot of the weapon offenses could come from, traffic stops where you find somebody a felon in possession of a restricted weapon or a firearm, or a case involving, a gun, whatnot, where somebody's, carrying it unlawfully. And those are down in our jurisdiction, but I think they were up in Medford, or at least status quo there. So different trends, different jurisdictions. And now this is the one number that I think we all kind of scratch our head at, but property crime is down statistically. Now, again, I think a big part of this for us is there's a couple things. We talked about this. One is just trying to figure out our NIBRs and our RMS systems to make sure that we're capturing the data completely. We know that we're not. So this is an underreported number right now. So next year, as we fine tune the way we capture this data, it should shoot up a little bit. So we don't want people to be necessarily concerned when they see that. We're trying to figure out this right now. But you do see a downward trend. And again, like I said, during the pandemic, we did see home burglaries decrease because people were at home. We saw some other things. Retail thefts may not have been as prevalent. So there are some factors that we do believe this number is trending down. We just don't know to this degree. And we're going to continue to evaluate that as we move forward.
We're running into some of the same issues the sheriff's department is with our RMS system and making sure our numbers are matching up. We're working through that, and every day we're getting closer, so we'll be able to have better statistics as we move through this process. And understanding from our perspective, understanding what these numbers for 2021 mean, and these spikes will take some years of data to really compare and try to determine what those actually mean. But we do have crimes against persons up in the city of Medford. We've had a spike in these type of crimes along the Greenway over this last year, and we have trended up. Crimes against society, it's back up to that area that we were in 2018. And in our crimes against society, we included drugs, prostitution, pornography, weapons laws, animal cruelty. You will see those weapons laws go up, the drugs go up as our workforce moves back from our protecting from COVID and trying to keep our workforce safe and encouraging proactivity. So we see those numbers go up as our officers get more active and get out of their cars and start engaging with people more. So homicides are up. We had 7 this last year. One of those was directly related to a drug rip, and 2 of those were homicides on the Greenway associated with some of our homelessness issues, but our numbers are up. So assaults are up. Again, this kind of mirrors what's happening nationally. We don't know exactly why this number is up this much, but it is one of those things that has trended up over this last year. Again, we will probably understand that more as we get more data in, as we get more accurate data in, we're able to look at that and how it trends out over years. DUIs are up, and that's again a function of how active our police officers are and how fully staffed we are. This is a number we like to see high because that means our officers are engaging in this activity. So weapons laws, I talked a little bit about that with crimes against society as our officers become more proactive. And in 2020, we did have some restrictions on proactive activity because we were trying to protect the workforce. We would expect this number to be higher than it was last year, but it is higher than it's been in some time. It is up. Disorderly conduct. This is a big issue in the city of Medford. It may not be in the county, but we have our downtown businesses, our downtown bars, and we are dealing with homelessness issues and our downtown businesses. We get a number of calls for this, lots of calls for this, and it is trended up. Kidnapping's up significantly. We talked to our DV officer, and there's been a significant uptick in kidnappings related to domestic violence. It'll look different, I believe, when the DA looks at it, but this is what we are charging, and we've had a considerable number of more kidnappings charged by the city of Medford Police Department. Property crimes are down, just like they are with the sheriff's department. Now we're not dealing with reporting issues like the sheriff's department because we've done things differently for a while now. Every crime gets a case number and gets a report. So we still have issues to work with our report writing system, our RMS, to make sure that things are transferring over correctly and they're coded correctly. But it appears that our property crimes are down. I do know that our burglaries are down significantly, and it looks like our thefts are down significantly. The reason for this, at this point, we don't know.
Thank you. All right. Now we just want to talk about some jail trends, correctional facility. So our lodging summary of 2021, we had 8,337 lodgings total, which is considerably lower than our past years, not necessarily the COVID year, but years prior to that. This is a number that is interesting though. Measure 11 lodgings, which is those are the more serious crimes. And I think everyone knows that, but I'll just say is if convicted, it usually attaches a mandatory prison sentence with it. So they're more serious crimes for sure. 309, and that number is way up compared to years prior, and we'll show you that graph. And so that's, where we're seeing maybe decreases in some of the property crime across the board. Our serious crime seems to be way up. So it's a very interesting trend. We forced release 3,200 plus folks early from custody this year. We've known that this has been a problem for us for many, many years in Jackson County. So about 39% of all lodgings and bookings are released too early. If you exclude book and release, the pandemic has kind of changed some of the patrol tactics a little bit, meaning cite and release is even used more now during, or post-COVID than it was prior, even though we used it a lot more than other jurisdictions because of our lack of jail space, at least statistically. It was even up again this year. So if you take away book and releases, which are, come over from the courts, people who were lodged to the back door, we're well over 50% of those individuals being forced released from our custody early, meaning before they can see a judge or before the judge would like to have them out per se. That's not good. Just so you know, Deschutes County has not reported a forced release since I've been the sheriff, and probably many years before that. Here's our statistics for the jail over time. You can see, at the peak of our lodgings was 2016, and just for reference, we had the basement closed at that time, so we were reduced capacity. We were at 14,000 lodgings, and this year at 8,300. And then you look at our forced releases. Again, that number is trending down in the same way as our lodgings are. We're still pretty high as far as our comparators across the state. We probably do have the most significant forced release issue, maybe other than Josephine County. Okay, here's the Measure 11 lodgings we talked about. Now, this is the number that is just kind of concerning when you talk about safety of the community and things of that nature. So in 2017, we kind of peaked out with our Measure 11 lodgings, at least in the time that I've been keeping data, with 216, which is almost like one per capita, as we were using about a 217,000 population base estimate at that time. And you can see as we opened the jail back up and we did some other things and crime started to trend down, we got to 153 Measure 11 lodgings in 2019. And then since the pandemic, we're up to 309. So we're over, 100% of where we were in 2019. So that's a pretty significant number to be up that high. And, we're up 50% from 2017, which was our, worst year for Measure 11 lodging. So it's pretty significant. And I'm going to turn it over to District Attorney Beth Heckert.
Thanks, Sheriff. So on this slide, I'm just trying to show how long it's taking for us to resolve cases. So these are our pending murder cases that we have. So we've already had one in 22, and then in 21, we had 11. My numbers look a little bit different than the sheriff and Medford because these are actual cases charged. So it could be they might have investigated like a murder-suicide. That wouldn't come to me, so that wouldn't show up in my numbers. And I'm also not counting victims. So if there were 2 victims, 1 defendant, then this is 1 case. So that's why our numbers don't quite look exactly the same. But we currently have 20 pending murder cases. And so that's 20 beds that are being taken up in the jail by those folks. And the oldest one goes back to 2018. So carrying all of those older cases forward, it just adds to the amount of cases, that any one deputy is handling. In the past, we used to give 1 murder case to a deputy, and when they resolved it, then they would go back in the rotation to get the next one. And I now have deputies that have 2, and some deputies have 3. So that's what's really affecting us. And then this is pending Measure 11 cases. So again, the data you saw from the sheriff and from Medford were arrests. So it's possible they arrested someone for a Measure 11 and we didn't file the Measure 11, or we set it up for grand jury and we didn't get the case through grand jury because the victim didn't cooperate. Just other factors like that change it. But again, this kind of shows how we're carrying those cases over. So we're carrying over the last 4 years, 183 cases, in addition to all the new cases that are coming in. And this is active cases that we're working. This isn't counting cases that are out on warrant status. So if I included the warrant status cases for each year, that would bump the numbers up pretty dramatically as well. On to the court.
So we just look at numbers and trends over time for court filings. So these are cases that have been filed to the court. So the officers make arrests, the district attorney looks at the charges and then sends the information over to the courts. And so you can see that we've been pretty busy each year. In fact, very busy when you look compared to other courts, but the brown or the orange line is going to be misdemeanor cases filed. As you can see, fairly high, but the felony numbers are really high. We're looking at 2,199 filings for 2021 still. And we have our civil commitments are really high as well. So we're looking at a lot of times officers, take people into custody on police officer holds, or maybe somebody's lodged, but then the issue of mental health comes up, and then those cases are diverted through the civil process and not necessarily the criminal process. And so I think we're doing a good job in our county of differentiating those two, the criminal and the civil piece, because we're pretty high compared to other counties as well. And I'll show you those numbers. If you look through the last 5 years of court filings, you look at Jackson, Deschutes, Lane, Marion, Clackamas, Washington, and Multnomah counties. And so if you just look at the felony line, we're at 16,300 filings over the last 5 years. That's higher than Deschutes by quite a bit. That's higher than Lane, it's higher than Marion, it's higher than Clackamas, and it's almost as high as Washington County. And Washington County's population right now is about 620,000 people. So they got about 400,000 more people within their county than we have here. And they're surrounded, they're up in the metro area. So they certainly have a much higher, I'll say, transient population, and people going through their county than we have, just because of where they're geographically located in the state. So when you look at those numbers, it tells me we have a very busy county. A lot of things going on here. A lot of issues, of course, we know that, but this work translates. The officers are busy, our jail's busy, the district attorney is busy, the judges are busy, and everyone is working really kind of what I like to say is we're fighting outside our weight class here. Community justice is on the back end of this, is cleaning it up, playing, the cleanup position because they're dealing with all the adjudicated cases, some pretrial. But this puts work on everybody much differently than other places because we're not resourced like these big counties. I don't know what a DA's office has in Washington County, but I imagine it's considerably bigger than what Beth has here in Jackson County. And so we're all working pretty hard. And I've talked about this before in other jail presentations that I've done is that we like to run red line in Jackson County. We're always at red line, so to speak. We're always got we're kind of max capacity, so to speak.
And Sheriff, on this slide, so like for deputy DAs, I have 21 deputy DAs in Jackson County. Deschutes, which is doing less than half of our cases in that time period, has 24 deputy DAs. Lane has 28. Marion has 33. Clackamas has 31. Washington, which is almost equal to what we're doing, has 41. And then of course Multnomah has 75. So it's a huge difference for per deputy caseloads when you start looking at that difference between number of deputy DAs. And I'm sure it's the same for police officers as well.
Correct. Yeah. So, I think we've gotten used to this type of workload in our county, from everybody from the patrol side all the way up through community justice as far as the criminal justice system goes. And we become, used to it or inoculated to it. And I think, it just becomes the norm, whereas it really creates additional challenges when you have, and again, I don't want to speak for Beth and she can chime in, but, if you had much less caseload, would cases resolve sooner if they could had a chance to work on them differently, if they had more energy or more time to put on each case, same for patrol officers, if they had more time to be proactive and to, root out problems, at the ground level or where they're occurring instead of just reacting to the problems, would we have this compounding effect of less calls for service, less crime, and so on and so forth. So it is really an issue. And, it's just, how do we address that moving forward? And I did want to offer the judges opportunity at this point, or Tina, to jump in. And do you have any additional comments or information you'd like to share with the group?
So, Sheriff, for us, this is Tina. And Judge McKee, I might want to speak to this too, but, you look at our court filings against other counties, we still have a huge backlog for the courts, and this sort of speaks to that, but something that we're working on, but with the pandemic, and then the numbers, and then more people being released every day, it's been harder and harder to get those cases going through our system. So I think that's another thing that we also have to look at when we look at how high our numbers are, and then the delays of those going to court. And Judge Mejia might want to talk about that a little bit too.
Back when we opened the court up a little bit in I believe it was June of last year for about a month, we did pretty well then in that basically that opening the court and getting some trials done. And yes, doing that had the effect which we had hoped for, that the actual threat of a trial would help and reduce other cases that were not set for trial. That did happen a little bit, but then of course we had to shut her down again because of Omicron. And I'm really concerned right now. We are opened up. We don't have a social distancing, so we can basically have as many trials as people want to try, but we're not getting a lot of cases tried lately. And that really concerns me. I hope if they finally say, mask off or something like that, we can get back up there to having 2 or 3 trials a week, and some of those significant trials. We have had some significant trials. Unfortunately, a couple of mine ended up in not resolving the entire case. A few convictions, but mistrials on other counts. But that's what I'm really hoping for, that the attitude and the culture kind of changes again, and hopefully get back towards that pre-COVID of, if you got a trial scheduled, it's likely to gonna go. And we've had, that's been another issue with some of our major trials. We had 2 major trials scheduled, but we couldn't do them because of COVID. And that was usually on the defendant's part or an attorney's part. But I have always been concerned about getting cases through the court ever since I've shown up here. Of course, COVID made it horrible. But I think, and Tina has given me a little bit of encouragement with the numbers she showed me last week, that we are starting to trend in the right direction.
Thank you, sir. Here's just another piece of, kind of the workload that we see with warrants for MPD and JCSO. So the majority of the county warrants countywide are entered either through MPD records or JCSO records. And as you can see, we've trended down over the last couple of years, but we're starting to trend back up. And, warrants would be on, people who fail to appear, for instance, or people who don't appear at all, or have some sort of a court obligation and don't show up and a warrant's entered. Or they could be a suspect in a crime and we've identified them and the district attorney could issue a warrant for their arrest. So that's another means a warrant could come out. You look in 2017, we had, our highest number of warrants at 13,660, 10,000 were for FTA, over 10,000. That's a significant problem. I think it still remains that today. I think the judges would attest to that. We're starting to see that number come back up where we were down considerably, half of that number after a couple of years of having some adequate, not adequate, but better jail space and the FTA program. And then, as we had to reduce space again at our facility, we're starting to see that FTA number crawl back up. And I know that's a huge issue for our judges and everybody else. It contributes to some significant workloads when somebody doesn't show up for court. And if you want to expand on that, Judge Mejia, feel free, but I do know that you're passionate about those.
We just have a lot of paperwork that we just have to do over and over. But another thing that it really affects is kind of the court capacity. Even though we don't have social distancing, we're trying to keep, the number of people in the courthouse as low as we can. And we just have to keep resetting cases over and over again. So we might not have the number of people scheduled that we actually could get through if people showed up. So yeah, that is a big problem now. The FTA, well, it's like you said, Sheriff. I mean, sometimes you guys are not even releasing people who have already made it to the chronic FTA list just because you don't have any room. And when we see those people on the list, we try to hold them on for a little bit, but we got the capacity issue.
All right. Eric?
Yeah, thanks, Sheriff. With community justice, we wanted to focus on our adult supervised population. We also include juvenile, but we're not going to focus on those numbers today. We wanted to look at a number of snapshots which indicate the number of people we're carrying on our probation and post-prison supervision case loads at any one time. And if you go back to 2018, you can see what for us was a pretty sharp rise, going from about 1,900 cases on any one day to a quick sharp rise in a year and a half to 2,300, 2,344 in terms of the number of people we're supervising. So the workload that put on our officers, particularly when the slope was going up like that, was pretty significant. We were just drowning in cases at that time, and our ability to adequately assess and process and supervise those folks was really limited. Since then, we had the pandemic. And as such, we stopped getting so many front-end referrals from courts. And with that, we saw our supervised population go down from a high of 2,300 to 1,884 at the beginning of 21. Since then, we've pretty much stabilized right around 1,900 cases. And I think that's an important picture to look at. We still have a lot of unknowns. There's a backlog of cases in our county that could result in more people coming in. Even though Measure 110 has significantly limited the number of drug cases we have coming in, the fact, if you go back, and we don't need to, Sheriff, but when you showed your drug case chart for Jackson County, it's still 200 cases in 2021, which I'm guessing, and I have nothing to base this on other than history, led the state in the number of drug cases that we saw. So we still have folks who are meeting that substantial quantity threshold that gets them system involved. So Jackson County still tends to be an outlier, and we very much are punching outside of our weight. So that's the sheriff's term, and it really seems to stick for what we're doing. And if you go to the next slide, Sheriff, And I know each of these graphs look similar, but what it represents is the way that our population in Jackson County breaks down. So if you look at all of those, 1,900 cases, or at one point 2,300 cases, we'd break them down by percentage of high risk, medium risk, and low risk. And the blue portion represents high risk clients. Now, when you hear high risk in community corrections, it refers to the likelihood that somebody will recidivate. They base it on an algorithm. It's very similar to your insurance company. They take a look at your past and try and predict the likelihood that you will recidivate. Well, in 2019 and 2020, right around 38% of our folks were assessing as high risk. And I'll show you in a minute, but that is a really high number. We still had 28% at medium, and our medium population has pretty much remained stable. What has changed is that in the last year, we've seen our high-risk population as a percentage of who we serve go from 38% down to 30%. So that's a significant drop in the people we supervise who are a high risk to recidivate. The likely and simplest explanation is that we don't have as many of those drug cases where people who were on supervision for drug cases recidivated frequently. It may not have been a high risk, super harmful recidivation, but it was considering it would keep them in the system. So we've seen that population drop off, which on a business level for what we do means that our officers can focus more on the people that we do have. 39% high risk is not very sustainable in terms of the number of contacts that are required for those folks, the number of interventions that are required. So now we're at a more manageable population. But if you go to the next slide, Sheriff, that manageable population, if you go to the far right, is still considerably more high risk than the rest of the state. That far right pie chart shows that the state operates right around 18% high risk. And our county, even though we've dropped a little bit, is still 29% high risk. So those are significantly more intensive cases that require more work on our part than do our state counterparts. So where Beth was kind of talking about the work that her shop is asked to do, and Tina was showing the work that the judges in Jackson County are asked to do. Similarly, we see that workload fall on community justice as well. And yet, so we have a really high workload. We have a high risk population in terms of what we do. But if you go to the last slide, Sheriff, just so we have some positive information to report, Jackson County is the green line on that graph, and the state is the blue line. And these are simply the number of cases that we close each year that are considered a positive case closure. You go back to 2017, only 56% of our cases that we closed were closed as positive. You saw that as it was about 6% less than the state average. The state was closing 62% of their folks as positive. Gradually, we've been able to, well, initially we really changed our philosophy and asked a different tack from our officers. We started focusing on client support and success, and we saw that raise significantly. And we've been able to maintain a success rate higher than our state partners over the last 5 years. And in the last 2 years, we've been really close to 80% of the cases that we close coming through as positive. And the main reason, again, and the credit goes to our officers, adapting strategies of engagement and support where necessary. The sheriff kind of said we were that, you didn't say strong safety, but I think you meant strong safety from a football perspective. Or for Dave Carter, we're that sweeper back there trying to keep people out of the goal. That is our role. That's what we're trying to do. And when we can be successful and fulfill our role, it means less work, hopefully, for Josh, less work for the prisons, and more successful outcomes for our law enforcement and for Beth's team when they give people probations or when we're asked to provide supervision. So we're proud of that last number. It's something we're going to try and continue on. And we've done that throughout the pandemic and throughout the wildfire that ripped through our community and took housing away from so many of the people that we are asked to supervise. So they were really one of the populations that were hit in terms of not being able to find housing. So that was our last, I think that's our last graph there. I just wanted to showcase those things. So
we just posing these questions. Again, we don't really have, at this point, with all the changes that have happened over the last couple years, we don't have a definitive thing to point our finger at as to why certain things are happening or why they're not happening or why this is down and this is up. But, just we've had a lot of changes. And so we talk about, Measure 110. I think we can evaluate that further as we move forward. Certainly there's individuals who have moved to our county or to our state as a whole from other places in the country. I've talked to our, the deputies on the ground who have had contact with these individuals. I'm sure this is probably more prevalent on the Greenway potentially, but people who have come here to use drugs because of the laws, right? And those individuals are typically have other challenges as well. We know that illegal cannabis production has caused a workload for our county in many ways. From violent crime to calls for service to livability issues to water issues. The reduced jail capacity, we know that is a consistent driver of a lot of our issues with regards to some of the violent crime we've seen, the increase in warrants, things of that nature. We do know that there is a significant association when we have to reduce capacity, that we see other issues as a result of that. The homelessness issue is more prevalent now, and I know we know that's driving some of Medford calls for service, specifically impacting Medford more than the other agencies with regard to their downtown corridor. And then the legislative initiatives, we talk about this, the legislators have been pretty hard on law enforcement in general because of some of the criminal justice reform, sentiment or initiatives across the country, specifically stemming from George Floyd. And these things do impact the way we do business. Case law changes. It's harder for, deputies and officers to conduct vehicle searches. There's more restrictions put on what we can and shouldn't do as far as enforcement. And those things do take a toll. And yet there's more bad legislation going through now that may make things even more restrictive. And anytime that you do that, I think they do so with some good intention, but just really unaware of the potential consequences for our communities. They certainly don't do things to make the community safer. And then the anti-police sentiment, while here our community has been great supporting our law enforcement, and we're very appreciative of that. But some of the stuff that's gone on across the state and the country has kind of leaked through. People pay attention, and that's been rough. And so keeping people in the profession has been more challenging. People have left law enforcement to take jobs in the private sector, and the recruiting has been more of a challenge, for my office, and I'm sure the other agencies here. But that's just a little bit, it wears on folks. But other than that, we're open to discussion, of course. If you have thoughts or ideas, please chime in.
Thanks, Sheriff. Appreciate you coordinating that. Are there any questions for the sheriff or anybody else who presented? Dr. Carter, Dave Carter.
Sheriff, I think you had a slide there about the jail capacity. I think it was like 220 was the current number of jail capacity. Is that right? I thought I saw it, but then I don't know if it
Yeah,
went.
I might have hit it. Sorry about that. Yeah. So prior to COVID, we went up to about 300 beds in use per day, and then we were able to go to 315 at night. And the reason being, for those that have toured our facility or have been in it, the design makes it a challenge to supervise when all of the inmates or adults in custody are out and about at night, because they're supposed to be sleeping. We could increase that capacity and not really compromise safety, so to speak. And we didn't want to release people during the nighttime, so we increased to 315. When COVID hit, we reduced to about 70% or so, maybe just under, to about 220 was our initial target for capacity. And that was because of the social distancing that needed to do and the quarantine issues, right? We had to bring people in and they had to spend so much time in certain areas before they could move into general population, or so to speak, or to our housing units. And so that really limited, and still to this day limits, our ability to use our facility. So I think like today, I think we were like 235, something like that. Maybe it was 240. And it fluctuates between now about 230 and about 250. So we've increased a little bit since we've become maybe a little more efficient with this, or we've had more long-term people staying in custody too. That's it. You've seen the Measure 11s and the murder cases. So when they get into that housing, upstairs or downstairs or whatever, we have a little more room there. So yes.
Oh, thank you. That's a great explanation. And my question, I guess, is kind of going towards when our system starts to kind of become more back to normal operations. Do you see kind of like this ramping back to full operation, getting us back to that 330, 315 number? Will there be any targets in terms of focusing in on what seems to be a pretty prevailing problem across our county? Is the for lack of a better term, the frequent flyers, the FTAs, the individuals that create an increased workload for all the system? Will there be any kind of a focus to keep those individuals maybe more so than just a site release as we ramp up back to full stream?
Yeah, as we increase our capacity, that will certainly be a goal. We getting up to 315 again might be a challenge, but we will see. We had some issues that stem from that. As far as just the amount of movement, we had more contraband issues, we had more use of force issues, we had more fights amongst our staff, more rule violations, so to speak. I think that's all accurate, Josh. Is that correct or not? And so when you cram that many folks into that piece, into that jail, the way it's designed, it does become a little bit more problematic. So we will gradually work back up. I don't know if we'll get to 315, but we're going to certainly try. And we still use our FTA program. I think we had 9 people in custody as of today on the FTA program. And I think total they have 144 or 43 charges amongst those 9 people. So pretty significant frequent flyers. We dedicate 10 beds to that program. And, maybe that could go up a few beds, that again, that's just going to depend. But we're really so strapped with our pretrial. It's hard to get anywhere. But certainly open to ideas on the best use of our bed space for sure.
I'm just curious. I think if I've got this right, that the Medford Police Department's embarking on a feasibility study. And I'm wondering if there's anything like that planned for the Sheriff's Department, or if it's perhaps even been done in the recent past.
And you say feasibility for staffing?
I believe for capacity, yeah.
Oh, we've done so many assessments and studies on the jail. We know that that's a huge contributor to our woes here in the county. I mean, that's probably the single biggest contributor to some of our criminal justice issues as a whole, is the bed space, because it just perpetuates the cycles and it leads to a lot of other things. But we've done, the National Institute of Corrections been here 3 times. The grand jury does an assessment every year. And for the last, I think 11 or 12 years now, their main recommendation is to build a bigger jail. But that's expensive. We put something on the ballot in 2020 for voters to look at. Arguably, probably the biggest, kick in the face with COVID at that time, because, we're just getting ready to ramp up some marketing pieces for that. And then COVID came and, what do you do? Nobody was out doing anything. Anyways, so, are we going to address that at some point? Maybe, hopefully, I'd like to. I certainly think that that's the best thing for our community, but again, that's a lot of work and that's really expensive and we need a funding stream.
Yeah, I know that was a disappointment. So I was sort of curious if it was going to come back around. So thank you for addressing that.
Yeah, there's we've had some other ideas we've thought about just to try to maybe increase some bed space, but I don't think we're ready to go. We don't have anything formally set to take it to the public. We are kind of in the idea phase right now.
Jennifer, I would just add, I had a question, and Eric did call on me for next, but I would just add, we also did do a full-blown feasibility study where we hired an external contractor to do that. That was for jail needs, jail staffing and operations. And we're required to do that by statute anytime you're going to create a service or special district. So we were proposing to do that. And in order to do that, you have to do a feasibility study. It's required by law. And it's a very thick study. We could probably get you a copy of it, but I think, as the sheriff pointed out, we've covered it about 10 times in terms of justifying, the need and the feasibility of actually doing it. Eric, my question was about your slides where you talked about the percentage of high-risk offenders going down from 2019 to 2021. And I saw the percent decreases. I'm wondering if that's because you're being effective in supervision and people are dropping down the risk levels, or if it's because you had an increase in total caseload and brought on more lower level offenders, which, gives the perception of a reduction of high risk cases, but you could still have the same number of bodies. So did your total caseload stay the same?
Our caseloads went down. So it had more to do with being able to successfully close out some cases that historically would have stayed on a lot longer. So that got rid of some of the high risk people. And I think our officers were very successful there. And then it was some of those shorter term drug supervision cases that we had that we're not getting for whatever, the 110 reasons that brought that in. So as we supervise fewer of those cases, it brings our risk profile down, and those already went off the rolls on a large degree. So
yeah, the only other thing that can be deceptive, and I just want to know for my own good really, is when you supervise high risk offenders, they tend to abscond. And when you close them to abscond, they're no longer part of the percentage you're reporting as being on high risk supervision. So do you know if you lost a lot of those high risk people to absconding rather than successful case closures, or a combination of both?
Yes, there's some of those where that is exactly what has happened and also some of that is the fact that if somebody's, and I should let our new deputy director, Tara Hubbard, to put her on the spot, but there's a dynamic that occurs where we've got probation violations, and if a person doesn't show up, they just maintain in that abscond cycle for a long time. So again, we look at our court capacity impacting probation. We look at the success of our cases, decreasing our risk level. But Tara, is that accurate as I phrase that?
That's correct. And they only get closed out to abscond once the warrant is active. And so a lot of our probation violations that are in the failure to appear cycle don't actually ever get really closed out to that abscond. So we're still showing those numbers.
Once you request a warrant, you typically override them to limit it because you've requested a warrant. What I was wondering is if you drop from 20% high risk to 15% high risk and 5% of them went to abscond, we really haven't lost them off supervision. They're still on our caseloads. They're just not showing in the numbers you're reporting. Right.
And I can dig deeper. I don't think that is the truth for the 10% drop. I don't know that that's it, but it's probably something we need to dig deeper on that for sure. So. Any other questions for any of the providers or presenters today? Well, Sheriff, thank you again for taking point on that and accepting all of our slides and data and getting us together to present. We will meet back in March. I believe resiliency is on the agenda in terms of how we look at our law enforcement and first responder community. And until then, thank you all, and we'll talk soon.